Tough questions, honest answers, real talk with the City of Oshawa.
Hi, everybody. Dan Carter here, the mayor for the great city of Oshawa and the host of Real Talk. Excited to welcome you to this unique podcast, and I hope that it'll inspire authentic conversations on topics that are important to you. My hope is that we'll address issues that are impacting our province and our country, and I know that our guests will bring different ideas and perspectives to the issues that we are facing. So let's get started with today's guest. Chief Peter Moreira, the chief of Durham Regional Police, leading over 1,200 members, serving an area of almost 2,500 square kilometers, one of the largest geographic areas, and a population growth in Durham region that continues to grow at over 2%. You know, policing has changed dramatically, and the calls for service across not only Durham region, but across the country continue to grow with the complexities that police officers are facing today in police services that include mental health, homelessness, addiction, and the time spent on these calls is increased and putting even more pressures on policing today. At the same time, the new Police Act has come into play and is having a huge impact on budgets with the police department, but police continue to be able to be committed in regards to open and transparency. So they've embraced this new Police Act and continue to find ways to make it happen. So many challenges, many opportunities, having the right team at the right time to meet these challenges. And I believe that, Chief, you are the right guy. It's great to be able to have you here on Real Talk. Thank you very much. You're the new chief 18 months?
Just over 18 months, and thanks for having me, Your Worship.
Hey, just out of curiosity, how do you like it so far?
I love everything about the Durham Regional Police Service. I was a 32-year member of the Toronto Police Service. It was where I worked. Toronto was where I worked. But I was born and raised in this region and have lived here all my life and chose to raise my family, and we're still here. And when this opportunity became available, something I never thought would be possible happened. And for a kid from Ajax to be the chief of the Durham Regional Police Service, it was quite a moment for me and one I'm fiercely proud of.
You know, I want to take this opportunity through this podcast, not only to talk about policing, but the changes in communities and culture. I want to talk about the challenges that are in front of us. Talk about 32 years ago. You know, what do you come from a police family? Were you encouraged by family to go into policing? How did you find your way into policing?
It's an interesting question. I can't remember a time when I didn't want to be in policing.
Really?
I didn't come from a police family, but I came from a family who constantly volunteered for everything, from coaching to helping out neighbors to, pitching into finished basements and homes that we bought. In everything I did from my family, it just taught me at a very young age that you have to give back to the community, and I saw it as a natural pathway. I thought about the underdogs within our society, the people who don't always have the voice, the power imbalances that exist. And I identified that really early on, and I saw my parents filling those voids and the effort that they put into it. And it was fertilizer to that seed that was there to give back to the community.
I've had the opportunity to get to know you a little bit, and I've heard this time and time again. Your parents played a significant role in regards to the development of who you are and the things that are fundamentally non-negotiable. They play a really important part. What was it about Mom and Dad that really kind of gave you that foundation and that commitment?
Well, they're still doing it to this day. I'm lucky enough to still have both my parents. And what they taught me was that there was no substitute for hard work. They taught me that the reward can be in helping others. And they showed me the joy that you can bring to others. And so for me, understanding that hard work equated to accountability equated to the honesty that you bring to every single interaction. And so growing up, my parents didn't speak perfect English. Because they didn't speak perfect English, I looked around and, I grew up in Ajax where we were really different. We were different. Our food was different. There was a lot about us that was not quite the same. And they embraced that and they made friends very quickly throughout the neighborhood. And I began to see that being authentic, being a real person is how they survived in Canada, coming here as immigrants. And it was that began my journey into policing and really drove me to look for ways to give back. So throughout my entire life, I have, volunteered in a number of different areas.
Just out of curiosity, do you remember the time that you told your parents you were going to join the force?
Yes. they never once told me what their dream for me was. They supported mine. And I know my mom cried a little bit when the recruiter came to our home, one of the final stages of a recruiting process. And it kind of hit my mom, I think, at that point. And I think she was a little worried about my safety, as parents are. But they were very supportive. They've never once told me that they wish I had done something else. And they've been absolute staunch supporters. And I was lucky to have found a young lady who I married, and she has been equally supportive of my goals and the things that I've been able to accomplish in my career have largely been because of the support I've received from my family.
It's amazing. Your partner plays such a significant role in regards to your success and also through the difficult days, them being there.
It's remarkable now having the opportunity to reflect as a parent myself on the choices my children make. They taught me a lot about how to react to those times in life and how to be there for your family. I can't overstate how important they were in where I am today, in the success that I've been able to enjoy. The other thing that they've done as well, and my wife has done this actually, is give me perspective and keep me humble.
But that's a key component in regards to leadership. Humility plays a significant role. You agree with that?
I fundamentally agree with that. Everything from I didn't empty the dishwasher when I was just watching the Leafs playing to, my dad asking me as many questions about the operational side of my job. What happened in this case? I heard about this. I read about this in the paper. To asking me how the people that I immediately work with, how are they doing? What is going on in their families? Are you asking about that? Are you involved in their lives? Are you forging those relationships? Because at the end of the day, leadership and public service is about relationships. And so that's what I've learned.
Your experience comes from being in one of the largest police forces in Canada, in the largest city and metropolitan area that has a very diverse community. And when you look back at your many years with Toronto Police Department and you look at those experiences, what were some of the greatest lessons you learned through that experience as a young constable and working through that? And how important was that to have that experience so that you now lead this force in the complexities of policing today?
It's an interesting question. I think one of the first comments I have to make is that when I started policing, cell phones didn't even exist. They weren't a thing. And just cell phones themselves and technology and how they play such a big part. Things are evolving at this rapid speed. But at its core, policing continues to be about, understanding those factors that impact public safety. So, you think about, my comment about cell phones. Today, evidence is captured on cell phones. Cell phones are used to commit crimes, which wasn't a reality when I first started. But today, I understand this because when I was a very young officer, just starting out, just a kid from Ajax in the big city, I began to see how the things that were built into me, those relationship pieces, the understanding how to talk to people, solicited information, and I was able to get information that others weren't. That is what propelled me through the ranks and what propelled me through policing. I had a lot of opportunities to do a lot of things very early in my career. And as well, it was all about hard work. So, my dad once told me, never try to be the smartest guy in the room, be the hardest working. There will always be somebody smarter in that room, but you decide whether they outwork you.
It's amazing when I've talked to your colleagues about you in Toronto and in regards to your success and not only your style, is your communication skills have been noticed, but also your big skill that a lot of them really pointed to was your listening skills. And especially in a mosaic like Toronto with the complexities that were there, I have to draw the conclusion that played a significant role in regards to the success you had, not only as an investigator, but also a leader in Toronto Police Services. Is that a fair assumption?
I'm humbled by that is what you've heard. All I know is that I just try to meet people where they're at, and I'm always very aware of the power imbalance that exists in society, both in my role as a police officer, my role as a Canadian versus somebody who perhaps is a refugee, for instance, their experiences that exist. And I've tried to find that equal footing in there where they feel as comfortable as I am in that conversation. The reality is that I draw from the experiences of that my parents had as well, being immigrants here, not speaking the language, something that is vivid in my mind. The chuckles that happen if my parents mispronounced words. Those things were all little experiences for me that I have not perpetrated against people that I served in the mosaic that is Toronto. And I think that it was so important for me to treat people the way I wish my parents had been treated through, their early years here in Canada. And that has served me very, very well. And I'd like to think it served the community that I've interacted with very well. The reality is that policing continues to evolve and change. Today in our region, I think the last stat was 3 out of every 5 people that are settling in Durham region were born outside of Canada. There's a cultural nuance that is happening here in our region, the likes of which I don't think we've experienced thus far in our evolution. And with these languages, it's so important that we are attracting the best of these communities to join our organization to increase our understanding of others.
I look at 2 things that you've said. One is your own cultural background and your parents' experience. And number 2, then being a staff superintendent in Toronto in one of the most diverse mosaics of the largest metropolitan city played a significant role in regards to not only your learning and your expansion as a police officer first and foremost, but also as a leader. How important, when you were a staff superintendent, did that propel your career forward? It
was fundamentally important. I think that, by the time I became a staff superintendent, I'd had many different leadership experiences. And I look back at, for instance, when I was a superintendent in charge of 51 Division, which is Regent Park. It's right downtown, a very urban, big problems there. Homelessness, mental health, and addiction reigns supreme within that community. Very high needs. And then we got this big influx of the redevelopment of Regent Park. And suddenly you had condos that were selling for $1 million in Regent Park. Today, it's much, much different. And I think about my experiences there leading a division that I actually had started policing in. I started at 51 Division as a very young constable, and coming back now as the unit commander was an incredible experience. It was as if nothing changed, but everything was different, if that makes any sense. The problems still exist. They were more pronounced. But now I had this new reality, this influx of money and redevelopment that had happened in Regent Park. And that brought people into some conflict. And it was there that I began to identify that, the importance of partnerships. And I sought out some of the most important community leaders. Many of them are vocal critics of the Toronto Police Service and policing in general. But I was very, very close to them, be it elected officials, defense lawyers that lived in Regent Park who are friends to this day, to community activists within the community. And I understood the importance of that finding that common ground. So by the time I became the staff superintendent in charge of, everything east of Yonge Street, I had already understood and learned this invaluable lesson. And that is that, at the end of the day, you can remove the socioeconomic realities that people have, employed, unemployed. You have a car, you use public transportation. All of those things can be stripped away. At the end of the day, we're human beings that need to interact with each other in order to survive and to have healthy communities. And this became very pronounced when we had the COVID and the shutdowns. You began to see a deterioration in those societal relationships that we had. And it created problems that we were just beginning to solve. And that's really where we began to see the homeless problem not being hidden in the shadows, but in every park in the downtown core. And you began to see different problems that were more pronounced that were very, very serious problems. And without proper and sound public policy, what we ended up getting is the displacement of many of the people who were suffering, who were precariously housed or homeless themselves, people who couldn't access care for their mental health and addictions. And then I began to see the real divide there in some of the service providers that existed, and how many of the decisions were made through ideology and not not sound reasoning and evidence. And I began to push back on those areas. And certainly I had a voice at that point as the staff superintendent, one of the two staff superintendents in charge of the public facing of policing in Toronto.
I want to turn the page just for a moment and talk about where we are today in policing. And I appreciate, by the way, you sharing your experiences, and especially in your early days as a police officer, your family influences. I really appreciate that, and your learning experiences, because I think that all adds up to not only the role and responsibility you've taken on here at Durham Region, but also the complexities of policing today. I want to talk about some uncomfortable things. There's been a big conversation, of course, about this whole defunding policing, and I've heard you speak on this before. And it's a really fascinating conversation because I think some people believe that defunding police means taking funding away and reallocating it. And I've heard you speak about investing in areas, not only on the front end, but also on the back end and in the center piece of it. Can you once again walk me through your interpretation of this kind of talk that has been going on and how you address it when people bring this subject matter up?
The defund movement was an interesting phenomenon that happened. And it really came out of the frustration that people were feeling when the perception is things were getting worse. And so it was punctuated by many things that actually happened south of the border, but by police officers in the U.S., some very high profile cases that happened. And it began this movement of the money should be spent in other places. And I've always been of the opinion that I'm willing to listen to the argument, but what are we doing with that money and how do we measure outcomes? And so that began conversations, not from a defensive point of view that I'm trying to protect a budget here. I'm never trying to protect a budget. I'm always trying to demonstrate the value for the investment that you put into your public safety dollars. I'm a taxpayer too in this region, and I believe in that. But the reality is that, we need to take the same approach to removing money from the police budget and putting it into something else and measure the outcomes that actually produces. And to my knowledge, no one's been able to effectively do that. This notion that you can simply lift and shift budgets and functions to another agency is not rooted in reality of what happens at 3:00 in the morning when many of these agencies aren't available. I will always listen to people who propose, these defund movements, and they call it different things in different areas. Right. But the reality is that, you have to be able to deliver services at 3:00 in the morning when everybody else is asleep. And that is the challenge that many organizations have. And no amount of funding is going to change that. We have a mental health partnership with Lake Ridge Health, where we partner a police officer and a nurse. But the problem is try to get a nurse with that level of experience who's willing to work, 4 night shifts in a row is very, very difficult. And it's not a criticism. It's just the reality of, again, rooted in the reality of how you deliver service. And this isn't an argument about how much money should be spent in policing versus, social services or any other agency. I think both have to be funded. I think you have to make investments in both. But there also needs to be some accountability tools built in which the reporting of outcomes is so important. We recently here in the region had a proposal for a non-police-led mental health initiative. And I pushed back on that a little bit with the region because of the number of, non-police led, it used a lot of police resources to get going that actually take us away from some of our core functions. But the reality is that I believe that we should be investing money, if we're going to be investing money, upstream to prevent people from getting into crisis in the first place, to address those unmet core needs that exist that lead people to be susceptible to things like human trafficking and in other areas. And I keep repeating to my staff all the time, and I've said this in many different areas, and that is, it's not a question of who leads, it's who leads when. And there's a continuum here, and we have to recognize that, we have an opportunity to interject in people's lives in really upstream before they get into this crisis state. And then we have a responsibility as the police to intervene when they are in the crisis state, because often there's no one else to do it. But this notion that somehow, there's one solution for all these problems and therefore you should take money away from the police and invest it in other areas is not rooted in reality.
These are complex issues that have many different tentacles to it, and it's going to take a whole bunch of different partners to be able to address the complexities that your officers are seeing at this particular time. And I think part of it is making sure that funding appropriately, both in healthcare, addiction, mental health, and policing, are adequate to be able to meet the needs of the most vulnerable in our community. And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I understand the challenges that are there, and all of us are looking for the right balance. And I just don't know if we're there yet, but we're trying our best to be able to get onto that journey, right?
So you're not putting words in my mouth. You said it much more eloquently than I have stated it. But I'll say this. I think it's so important that we not shut out the voices that are there. That is why, even when I was in Regent Park, I sought out those that were really critical of the police in order to be partners. I wanted their voice involved in things.
And many of those individuals, when you came to Durham Region, also supported your efforts to come to Durham Region and talked about your efforts with them in Toronto. So I don't want that passed by. So your critics were also seeing the authentic leadership that you were bringing and said, this is a guy that's going to help your community as it is becoming so diverse and challenging of large metropolitan cities. So I just wanted to add that for those that are listening.
No, I appreciate that. And, you lose people if you're not authentic. And whether that is internally or externally, they're both important. And I work really hard at demonstrating that. I don't own all the answers. And so it goes back to the comment I was making, and that is no one owns all the answers. These are nuanced, complicated conversations that we're having that sometimes change by the municipality and the services available to the individuals involved in these complex issues. The reality is, though, that we tend to talk over people, and sometimes ideology is driving the conversation as opposed to truly listening. And when you're listening in order to reply versus understanding, this is where we get into this circle conversation that never gets us anywhere. And we begin to point fingers and say, well, money should be spent here or money should be spent there. The reality is that there are many different needs. You mentioned a few of them there, but as our region gets bigger, we're going to need more ambulances. We're going to need more firefighters. We're going to, need all of these social services that underpin communities.
Was it a shock to you in 2020 to see the unsheltered population grow at such a rapid pace? Was it hidden before and it just came to the surface in 2020? I know, and I can speak on behalf of our city, we had never seen the influx of those that were struggling in our city to the magnitude that we're seeing in 2025 now. And I'm not the only one. I speak to small communities, to the west and to the east of us, and they're seeing the same thing.
I think that what happened in 2020 really revolved around the vulnerabilities of the social safety net that we have. And so many service providers just simply shut their doors. They didn't know what to do. And so people were no longer receiving, their support, their counseling, their meds. Many people went without getting medications because they couldn't get the nurse or the doctor that would prescribe their medicine was no longer available to them at the shelter that they accessed. And so they may have been precariously housed, but now they were truly on their own because there was nobody to support. And then many of the services were centered and combined into, just a few areas throughout the city of Toronto. And I'm speaking about my experiences in Toronto now. And so you build it and they will come. And so if this was the only place you can get a sandwich or even have wounds tended to that can get infected and lead to other problems, people began to congregate in certain areas. The trouble with that, of course, is that this is a very high needs community. And when they began to live in tents and in parks, as well intentioned as that was by many of the advocates and people in this industry, the reality is that this population was victimized at a disproportional rate. There were many people who were trafficked, sexually assaulted. Drugs were prevalent in these areas, and overdoses were off the charts. You began to see weapons being seized from these parks at unprecedented rates. It became as violent as any place, geographical place that I've seen. You would never send one officer into an encampment. It would have to be 4 or 5. You began to see this tension that was growing within the city because there was no plan. There was no plan for people. And then that attracts those who want to prey upon the communities. And so you began to see a lot of trafficking happening. You could see the drug dealers standing there. And you began to see, if you ever questioned anything, they would just call you anti-harm reduction, anti-homeless, anti-this, anti-that. and we got into the name calling, which is, one of the problems in what I was just talking about. We have to stop talking over each other and start listening and understanding.
As leading this force, you now have, and I understand what I face on a daily basis, are many complex issues, but not to the extreme you do. I'll just highlight a couple of them. You're the number one source in regards to mental health calls. You're the number one call when it comes to guns that are on our streets. You're the number one call when it comes to human trafficking. You're the number one call when it comes to domestic violence. You're the number one call when you have public disturbances or individuals that are unfortunately very vulnerable and maybe having mental health challenges in the public. You are trying to address all of these issues in policing and at the same time be part of we haven't even talked about the auto industry, but you're trying to be part of the conversation to bring ideas and concepts forward. But your first and foremost duty is to be a sworn police officer and to lead a law enforcement to be able to address these things. For most of us, we would be overwhelmed because these aren't just emerging issues. These are major issues. We have a fentanyl crisis in this country that everybody is trying to address. You're on the front end of that. How do you do it?
It's an interesting question, and I can say I'm lucky. I'm lucky. I have an incredible team of very dedicated senior leaders within the organization. I have up and coming young leaders who are joining our organization and people joining our organization every day that have lived experiences that I don't. And so many of the solutions to these problems actually lie within our organization. My job in some ways is much easier because I have to, number one, and what I tell every single recruit is to stay curious throughout your entire career. Begin to question your assumptions on things. Stay educated and informed on the profession that you choose. And I'm deeply committed. I read academic research all the time. And I think you and I exchanged some links to many of the articles and publications that come out on various issues that we're both trying to tackle. The reality is that acknowledging that you don't have all the answers is the first step. Building out a team and encouraging them and developing them and investing in all of our senior leaders is one way to overcome some of these challenges. The solutions lie within that bigger group of people. The other important role that I have is advocacy. So whether it's at regional council and municipal councils, with the provincial government, I'm also on the executive for the Ontario Associations of Chief of Police to have a voice for Durham Region at the provincial level. I regularly speak to, every level of government, including the Attorney General of Canada was in my office, and we were discussing things like bail. The issues that you describe are not one-offs. They speak to an element of criminality that is actually either about the victim in cases like human trafficking. If we can strengthen and build resiliency and address the unmet core needs of people who are experiencing human trafficking, for instance, we can reduce the instances of human trafficking. To, advocating for more technology that addresses, our auto theft issues that we're facing. The reality is the third column of that actually relies or relates to the offenders themselves and not having proper consequences, in my opinion.
Is the system so broken that it's unrepairable? I'm not trying to be a doomsday person or darkness, but I just sometimes you look at it as policing is one component, healthcare is another component, mental health care is another component of it, housing is a component of it, economic challenges is another component of it. Incarceration is another, rehabilitation is another component of it. Is the system so broken that all you can do in policing is do the best you can in policing? Or is this a moment in history that not only calls for you to be at your best, but all the rest to be at their best, to be around the table, to be able to say, we understand the system's not working to what we believe we can achieve, and these are the things that we're willing to take on, and do we have the courage to do it together?
That's an interesting question, and I don't think it's broken beyond repair, but I think that we need a commitment to solve these issues on a systemic level, so an enterprise level. The reality is that solving policing itself is not going to make the changes that we need. We actually need to invest in education and health and social services. We need to to look at all of those things that build communities and begin to properly address that and be informed by one another.
Is the willingness there, Chief?
No, there is not a willingness. It's ideology driven right now, and that is a huge concern to me. And I say this because I know it's well intentioned. I do. We have good people, but the reality is that we have decisions that are being made in different levels of government that are disjointed from what Canadians are experiencing. I'll give you a prime example. So Parliament passes criminal offenses. So they pass a law and that law becomes part of the criminal code. So Parliament has decided, elected officials have decided that the possession of narcotics is illegal. The public prosecutions of Canada, the federal crown attorneys that prosecute those cases, has unilaterally, an unelected body has unilaterally said, we're not going to be prosecuting those offenses because it's not in the public's interest. Except that those are the very charges that often lead to those. That's the start of investigations that lead to things like seizing guns that impact disproportionately communities. Those are that is how we begin to have the grounds to conduct higher level investigations. And so, in Durham region last year, 300 cases were laid and 300 cases were withdrawn. That is a problem when an unelected body can simply say to Parliament, thanks, but no thanks. And this illustrates the problem, that there was no consultation with the police. I wrote a letter and what I got back was, don't worry about what we do. You just do what you think is right. Well, to engage in those kinds of investigations demands a great deal of police resources. And when I have a finite number of resources and my demand continues to grow, guess where those resources are going to go? To the areas that have it. It's not to say that we shouldn't be engaged in that kind of activity. And I raise this issue because I can point to many different examples where this is the reality. I'm really, really concerned about how we're trending in these areas because we're often dealing with the same people over and over and over again. And then people begin to lose faith in the administration of justice. And when the number one charge that is withdrawn is fail to comply with the conditions of release and more people are being released, people are thumbing their nose at the sort of processes and institutions that we actually have in place that govern our social contract.
And they point directly to policing, not the courts.
And they point to the police. Why did the police give them bail?
Right.
Is something I often hear. And then by the end of the conversation, people are like, well, why are the courts doing that? And I'm like, okay, now that's an accurate question. And so it's not about finger pointing here at the courts, but Bill C-75 that came into place in the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, fundamentally changed how bail is governed in this country. When 23% of everybody we arrest for a firearms offense in this region is out on bail for a serious violent crime bail, it sort of illustrates my point.
I'm running out of time and I want to make sure that we pick up on this point. And the point being is, so what needs to happen nationally, locally in regards to these conversations? Is this part of an opportunity? Who else needs to be part of these conversations so that we can see systematic change that happens and stand in brave places to be able to say it may be uncomfortable, but it is for the betterment. And by the way, it's going to be evolutionary because we are going to make errors. We are going to make missteps, but the intention is this is what we're trying to accomplish.
I think the answer is transparency. It is about having honest conversations and with our communities. Public discourse is governed today by name calling on social media. The reality is not unlike what happened to me in Toronto, where people said, "Oh, you're anti-homeless, you're anti-harm reduction, you're anti-this." We default to name calling. What we have to have is an honest conversation about what kind of society we want and where the gaps are today. There's some solutions that come from the people who are, on the political spectrum left of center. I think they have some really good ideas. I think the centralists have really good ideas. I think the right has really good ideas. We need to kind of blend those things in and serve the largest majority of Canadians that we possibly can. But when we default to our corners and stop listening and truly understanding, this is what creates these problems, and this is what allows these problems to continue to fester and grow. I can tell you that Durham Regional Police Service, we're about to roll out our new crime dashboard that is going to be telling this story in a very transparent way. We're going to be providing unprecedented levels of information to our community, because a well-informed community will never hurt us. It will only better inform the decisions we make moving forward. And more importantly, it's a mechanism to hold me accountable and the decisions I make and our organization makes, and that's healthy.
I had a conversation just recently on this podcast with Dr. Scott Henderson from Trent University. We talked about culture and we talked about local media and about holding leaders accountable and how that vacuum is not good for a community. It's not good for society. We need that presence, not only to hold us accountable, but also to have the conversations. You know, it's funny when people say to me, you know, where do you stand? I said, well, I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm very socially conscious and I have a lot of liberal friends. So I'm not really sure where I stand. That really is the mosaic that I come from, because I'm always in this kind of hunger stage, this student stage of trying to look for solution-based ideas. I have my core beliefs that I believe in, but I also never take a position that I absolutely have to be right and everybody else has to be wrong. And I think that that's part of where we need to get society. I mean, it doesn't have to be you're 100% right and I'm 100% wrong. And it's one of the great fabrics that used to happen in our country. We used to have these wonderful conversations and debates and discussions looking truly for solutions based upon complex issues. And I think that that's kind of what's missing today. And I'm hoping that we can get there. And I think these kind of opportunities, I think, help.
I completely agree. In fact, my senior staff will often hear me repeat, if all you're going to do is nod your head in agreement, then we're going to stop having these meetings. I actually invite a debate. I really like when people are challenged. It helps me understand the topics better. It challenges my assumptions, because I also live with, the human condition of assuming different things. And it helps me better serve the public when I have a good understanding that not everybody may think about a topic the same way I'm thinking about it that moment. And I truly, truly incorporate as often as I can the ideas of others who disagree with me into the solutions, because people need to see themselves and see a little bit of themselves in the solutions that we desperately need as a society to overcome some of these challenges.
I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity.
This is both nerve-wracking and so enjoyable. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about one of the greatest policing organizations, the Durham Regional Police Service. And I appreciate you letting me talk a little bit about my family and my experiences thus far.
I think it's important. We wanted to have authentic conversations here, and sometimes we go into a lot of different directions, but I think it's really important that when people can hear an authentic answer, the core beliefs, I think that helps people understand and not jump to conclusions, but maybe be curious about finding out more. So, Chief, it is great to be able to have you here. Thank you for your commitment to our community, and I really enjoyed our conversation. We want more of these conversations to continue, and I'm excited about the opportunity to join you on a monthly basis. And just a reminder, you can subscribe to Real Talk Oshawa. It's on Spotify and Apple. And what we want to do is we really want to make sure that you come back month after month to be able to hear the conversations that we're having. I promise you, we will continue to bring you interesting guests, subject matters that may get us uncomfortable, but I think they're important conversations. And the ultimate aspect of it is that each and every one of us walk away a little bit better informed. So keep the conversation. I'm Dan Carter for Real Talk. Thank you for joining us. Till next time, stay well.